It was just supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to get away from the grind of life. My name's Lucas, and I'm 32 years old. I'd been working non-stop in Paris for months, and my mind was frayed. A friend of mine, Claire, had suggested a cabin in the middle of nowhere in the French countryside, near a tiny village called Auzit. It was isolated, quiet, no one would bother me. Just what I needed. The cabin, a stone cottage, was small but charming. I found it through a listing online and thought it would be perfect for some much-needed solitude. The owner, an older man named Henri, had been kind enough to leave the key under a rock by the porch. That's how remote this place was. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and even though the location was stunning, the silence was almost oppressive. It was peaceful, but in a way that felt too still. I arrived on a Friday evening, and as I unpacked my things, I couldn't help but notice the strange quietness around me. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the wind was barely enough to ruffle the trees. The sun was setting fast, and I realized I'd arrived just as dusk began to settle in. The cabin itself had a certain weathered charm, with a stone fireplace that was the centerpiece of the living room, a wooden beam across the ceiling, and old furniture that seemed out of place in time. There were no modern conveniences here, just the basics. A small kitchen, a wooden table, a couple of armchairs by the fire. It was perfect for someone who wanted to disconnect. The first night went by quietly. I spent the evening unpacking, making a small meal, and reading a book by the fire. It was relaxing, just what I needed to unwind. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not from a dream, but from something more unsettling. There was a noise light at first, a faint scraping sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the house settling. But then it happened again, louder this time. I sat up in bed, trying to place the sound. It was coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I stood up, pulled on my jacket, and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen. The moonlight outside was dim, but I could still make out the shape of the forest surrounding the cabin. The trees were thick, tall, and black against the sky. The scraping sound came again. This time, it was clearer. It sounded like something was dragging along the ground. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. I walked around the cabin, trying to trace the sound. It stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it was just some animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer, right by the back door of the cabin. I shined the flashlight in that direction. There was nothing there. I felt a twinge of unease, but I told myself it was just my nerves. It had been a long day of travel, and the isolation of the cabin was playing tricks on my mind. I decided to head back inside, lock the door, and try to get some sleep. The next day, I decided to take a walk into the surrounding woods. It was a bright, sunny morning, and the forest was quiet but peaceful. The birds were singing, the leaves rustling underfoot as I made my way through the trees. The forest seemed endless, stretching for miles in all directions. There were no signs of anyone else around. I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived in Auzit the day before. I kept walking, enjoying the solitude, until I stumbled upon something that caught my attention. It was a set of footprints, large and heavy, leading off the main trail into the deeper part of the woods. They didn't look like the prints of any animal I knew. They were too large for a deer and too round, almost human-like, though the shape of the toes was off, elongated and strangely distorted. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the footprints. They led me deeper into the woods, twisting and turning through the thick trees. After about half an hour of walking, the prints stopped abruptly in front of a large stone outcrop. It looked like a natural barrier, a rock wall rising from the earth. I stood there for a moment, confused. The footprints just ended. There was no sign of where they had gone after that. I looked around, trying to make sense of it, but nothing seemed to add up. My head started to spin a little. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine and turned back toward the cabin. I didn't feel like venturing any deeper into the woods after that. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I tried to distract myself with a book, some music, and even some light chores around the cabin. But something felt off, like I wasn't alone. The thought kept creeping into my mind. Every now and then, I'd hear a rustling outside or a faint movement from the trees, but whenever I went to check, there was nothing there. That night, as I sat by the fire, I felt a sudden urge to check the back door again. I hadn't heard anything strange, but something told me to do it. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. I shined the light around the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the yard and the trees. That's when I saw it. Something dark and fast moving through the trees at the edge of my property. It was unlike anything I had seen before, moving in jerky, unnatural motions. The flashlight beam barely caught it before it vanished into the night. My heart raced. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with what I'd just seen. It didn't make sense. The movement was too strange, too erratic. I hurried back inside, locked the door, and sat down in front of the fire, my mind spinning with thoughts of what could be out there. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone at that cabin, and the strange noises, the footprints, and the dark shape I saw in the trees were too much to ignore. I packed up quickly, too quickly, and by noon, I was on my way back to Paris. It was a long drive back, and as I passed through the small village of Auzit, I saw Henri again. He was sitting outside his little shop, waving as I drove by. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice friendly. I hesitated for a moment, but then I nodded. "Yeah," I said, though I didn't feel like I was telling the whole truth. Just needed to head back early. It wasn't what I expected. Henri gave me a small smile. "It can be quiet out there," he said, "but some people like it that way." I nodded and drove off, not looking back. As I left the village behind and headed toward Paris, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. I'd never go back to that cabin, never venture into those woods again. Whatever had been there, I didn't want to know. I arrived back in Paris by evening. The bustling city lights a stark contrast to the eerie quiet I'd left behind. I had almost forgotten about the strange occurrences, until one night, weeks later, I found something in the pocket of the jacket I'd worn to the cabin. It was a small, frayed piece of fabric, torn and dirty, like something that had been ripped from the hem of a coat. It was old, the kind of thing that would have come from something far longer worn out in the woods. I stared at it for a long time, and the realization hit me. It hadn't been just an animal. Whatever had followed me that night wasn't from this world. But I would never be able to prove it. The evidence was gone, and with it, the mystery. All I had left was that strange, frayed piece of fabric, a silent reminder of something I could never explain. And that was the last time I ever went near the French countryside again. It was early November when I arrived at the cabin. The roads had been bad for the past week. Snow and ice had blanketed the higher elevations, and the forecast called for more of the same. I didn't mind. There was something about the isolation that I liked. I had rented the place for the next 2 weeks. Just me, a stack of books, and the silence. I was ready for some time alone after months of chaotic work, constant meetings, and barely having time to sleep. This was my escape. The cabin sat on a narrow, winding road in the northern part of New Mexico, just outside the small town of Tres Piedras. It wasn't much, just a one-story structure with a slanted roof, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a movie. It was surrounded by pine trees and overlooked a small valley where the Rio Grande twisted through the landscape. The cabin had been built decades ago by a man who had long since passed, and its rough-hewn logs and weathered exterior gave it a look that said it had seen many seasons come and go. I parked my truck, the tires crunching on the thin layer of snow that had settled over the gravel driveway, and unloaded my bags. The air was cold, biting at my skin with an intensity that felt sharper than it had back in town. I'd been expecting that. The mountain air had a way of doing that. Still, I had to admit, standing there with the snow swirling around and the sun barely peeking through the thick cloud cover, It felt like I was stepping into another world. The key to the cabin was hidden under a rock, like the owner had said it would be. I found it without trouble and unlocked the front door. The hinges creaked in protest, and a sharp, musty smell hit me the second I stepped inside. It was nothing overwhelming, just the kind of odor that came with an old building that hadn't been lived in regularly. I flipped on the lights, and the place came alive with the soft hum of the overhead bulbs. Inside, the cabin was simple. A living area with a stone fireplace on one wall, a few mismatched chairs scattered around, and a low coffee table in the middle. A rug lay in front of the fireplace, worn but still colorful. The kitchen was small, just a few cabinets, an old stove, and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. A hallway led to 2 small bedrooms. I knew the cabin wasn't much, but it was exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, secluded, and far away from everything. I unpacked my things, setting up my books and clothes in one of the bedrooms, the one facing the woods. I liked the idea of waking up with the view of the trees. The second bedroom, with its single bed and a narrow window, would be used for storage. I had no intention of venturing outside until I was ready to leave. The temperature was dropping fast, and the sky was overcast. Felt like a storm was coming. The first couple of days were exactly what I wanted. I woke up late, read my books, made simple meals, and went to bed early. The cold outside didn't bother me. In fact, it made the cabin feel even more like a refuge. There was no phone signal, no internet, just the quiet hum of isolation. It was peaceful, but by the third night, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint right away. It was just small things, sounds that didn't seem to belong. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside. But then I started hearing something like scratching at the door. I would get up, check, and nothing would be there. The snow had been falling heavily that day, and there were no tracks leading up to the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind again. The next night, it happened again, scratching at the door. This time, I was a little more unsettled. I stood in the living room, listening, trying to figure out what it could be. The trees around the cabin creaked and moaned in the wind, but this was different. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, scanning the porch and the snow-covered ground for any sign of what might have made the sound. There was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no animals. Just the snow, untouched and still. I closed the door quickly, heart racing, and locked it behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Scratching. It was coming from the back of the cabin now, where the windows looked out into the forest. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or something, looking for food. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't feel like it was something as simple as that. I kept thinking back to the stories the locals had told me when I stopped in town for supplies. Old legends about the area, things about skinwalkers, strange figures in the woods, and people who'd gone missing and never come back. I had brushed them off as superstition, but now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I woke up early and went outside to check the surroundings. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky had cleared up, but everything was covered in a fresh layer of white. No footprints, not a sign of anything that could explain the noises. I spent the rest of the day in a strange mix of unease and determination. If it was just an animal, I could handle it. If it was something else, though, I didn't know what to do. I tried to distract myself with books and cooking, but the cabin felt different now. There was a sense of tension, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I spent hours staring out the windows, trying to catch sight of something, anything, that might explain what was going on. On the 5th night, things escalated. The scratching started again, but this time it was louder. It wasn't just at the door or the windows. It was all around the cabin, as though something was moving just outside the walls, clawing its way around. The noise was constant, relentless, like a dozen unseen creatures were pacing the perimeter. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside, determined to get to the bottom of it. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the beam of my flashlight cutting through the snow. I swept it across the ground, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The scratching didn't stop, but it was coming from every direction. Then, as I moved the flashlight toward the back of the cabin, I saw something. A figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, standing motionless in the shadows between the trees. I froze. My first thought was that it was a person, but there was something wrong about it. The shape was wrong. It didn't move like a person. I couldn't tell if it was just the shadow or if it was something else. Before I could even think about what to do next, it turned, its head jerking unnaturally, and disappeared into the woods. I didn't wait. I ran back inside the cabin, locked the door, and didn't leave again until morning. That night, I didn't hear the scratching. The next few days were eerily quiet. I kept the lights on and stayed close to the windows, watching for any sign of the figure I'd seen. The weather had turned colder, and the roads were becoming impassable. I was stuck. There was no way out. Then, on the final night of my stay, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. Slowly, I pulled myself out of bed, heart hammering in my chest. The window was covered with frost, but I could see the faintest silhouette outside, moving just beyond the glass. I stood there, holding my breath, staring at the shadow. It was the same shape, the same figure, but this time it didn't disappear. Instead, it slowly turned its head toward me. I backed away, my feet stumbling as I made my way to the door. I didn't know if I was going to make it out alive. By morning, the figure was gone, and when I checked the window, there were no signs that anyone or anything had been there. The frost had melted, and there were no scratches, no marks, nothing. I left the cabin that day. I didn't come back for years. The first thing I noticed was the cold, sharp air that hit me the moment I stepped out of the truck. The cabin was barely visible through the dense trees, swallowed up by the snow-covered forest, but I had been here before. It wasn't the first time I'd come to hunt this remote part of northern Michigan. It had always been peaceful, quiet, just the kind of place I needed to clear my head. This year was different, though. I had been feeling uneasy the last few days, like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the long drive, maybe it was the way the trees looked darker than usual, but something about the place felt wrong. The cabin was an old structure, built by my grandfather back in the 70s. He had left it to me after he passed a few years ago. It wasn't much, just a small, single-story wooden building with a fireplace, a couple of rooms, and a small kitchen. It had been through a lot of winters, and you could see it in the way the wood creaked in the cold and the way the roof had started to sag. But it had character. It was a place that felt like home, even if it was isolated. I had always enjoyed the solitude. I carried my gear inside, the weight of the rifle over my shoulder reminding me why I was here. Hunting. That was the reason I came up every year. To get away from the noise of everyday life, to focus on something simple. Just the rifle, the trees, and the silence. It was already late afternoon when I set up. The sun was sinking low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The temperature had dropped quickly, and I could feel the bite of the winter wind seeping through the cracks in the cabin's walls. I started a fire in the stove, the crackling of the wood filling the space with a warm glow, and sat down at the small wooden table to unpack my supplies. The wind outside howled, rattling the cabin's old windows, and I noticed the stillness that had fallen over the place. It wasn't just the usual silence of being deep in the woods. It was something else. It felt like the air was holding its breath. There was no movement, no animals rustling in the underbrush, no birds calling in the distance, just that unnerving stillness. I shrugged it off. It was probably nothing. Maybe a storm was coming in, or the weather was just acting up. Still, the feeling of unease didn't go away. I decided to go check the trail cam I had set up near the edge of the forest earlier that morning. It was the perfect time, just before dusk when the animals would be most active. I grabbed my rifle, slipped into my boots, and headed out. The snow crunched under my feet as I walked through the trees, the cold biting into my face. The wind had picked up, but it wasn't enough to deter me. The camera was about half a mile down the trail. I had walked this path many times, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. What did make me uneasy was the absolute quiet. The wind had started to fade, but everything else seemed to be still. When I reached the trail cam, I knelt down to check the footage. The screen flickered to life, but what I saw made my stomach drop. The footage was strange, like it was jumping and warping, but I could make out a figure. A dark shape moving in the background, too large to be a deer or any other animal I had seen before. It seemed to be walking upright like a person, but its movements were unnatural, jerky, like it wasn't quite in sync with the world around it. My heart rate picked up. I didn't know what I was looking at, but something told me it wasn't something I should be out here alone to confront. I quickly turned the camera off, the sudden realization that something wasn't right settling in the pit of my stomach. I stood up and started to head back, my eyes darting around the trees, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. That's when I heard it, a rustle like something large moving through the brush, just off the trail. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. The sound was deliberate, almost too calculated. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My breath came in short, quick bursts as I slowly turned my head towards the noise. Nothing, just the dark, snow-covered forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't wait around to find out. I started walking faster, my pace quickening into a near run as the noise seemed to follow me. I didn't turn to look, but I could feel it, whatever it was, getting closer. The air felt heavier, the wind now howling in my ears as I made my way back to the cabin. When I finally made it inside, I slammed the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stood in the small entryway, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't explain it. The noise, the figure on the trail cam, the feeling of being watched, it didn't make sense. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves. Maybe I had been out too long in the cold. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the thought that something was out there in those woods. And it wasn't something I understood. I sat by the fire, trying to calm down, but I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind. I hadn't seen it clearly, but I could still feel the weight of it, that strange wrongness to its movement. It felt too big to be a man, too unnatural to be an animal. It felt like it was something that wasn't supposed to be out there, and I was alone. As night fell, the wind picked up again, this time louder than before. It howled around the cabin, rattling the windows with an almost angry force. I kept the lights low, the fire crackling in the corner as I tried to stay calm. But then I heard something that stopped me cold. A knock, soft, deliberate, came from the door. I froze. Couldn't be. It was too late for anyone to be out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I hadn't seen anyone for days. I grabbed my rifle from the corner, my hands trembling as I stood in the dim light of the cabin. Another knock, this time louder, followed by a scraping sound. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't supposed to be here. I couldn't just open the door. I couldn't risk it. So I waited, listening to the sound of the wind and the scrape of something against the wood. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. Maybe it was minutes, maybe hours. But eventually the sounds stopped. The knocking, the scraping, all of it just stopped. I didn't go to the door. I stayed in my chair, eyes darting around the room, half expecting something to leap out of the shadows. But nothing happened. The house was quiet again, too quiet. I spent the rest of the night in that cabin, too terrified to leave, too paranoid to sleep. I stayed by the fire, rifle in hand, listening to the wind batter the walls. I don't know when the sound stopped. I don't know if it was just the storm passing, or if I had imagined the whole thing. But when the sun came up the next morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed up my things quickly, my hands shaking, and made my way out of the cabin. The forest was still and silent, as if the night had never happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, that something had been watching me. As I drove away, the sun rising behind me, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was small and distant, barely visible through the trees. I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. It was a Thursday when I decided to take the drive up to the cabin. I didn't have any particular reason for needing to be there, just a long weekend to myself. The kind of thing you do when you're feeling tired, overwhelmed, and need some space away from the usual chaos of life. I wasn't running from anything, not really, but the idea of quiet, of nothing but the sounds of trees swaying in the wind and the occasional creak of wood settling in a house that hadn't been used in months, felt like the kind of reset I needed. The cabin was in a secluded area, far from any neighbors or towns. In fact, it was a good 2 hours north of where I lived in Salt Lake City, Utah, out in the middle of the forest where the road seemed to get narrower the further you went. By the time I turned onto the dirt road leading up to it, the rain had started. The kind of rain that didn't just drizzle, but came down in sheets, as if the clouds were emptying themselves out over the mountains. It wasn't too heavy at first, but it was constant, a low hum against the roof of my car. My headlights cut through the mist and trees, but only just barely. The cabin was small, a 2-story affair with wood paneling that was starting to show its age. The paint was chipped, and there were a few boards that seemed like they had warped in the weather over time. I had inherited it from my uncle, someone I barely knew but who had passed away a year ago. It wasn't much, but it was comfortable enough for one person, and that's all I needed. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my tires as I pulled up to the front porch. I took a moment before getting out of the car, my eyes scanning the surroundings. It was late afternoon now, the sun long gone, and the rain was coming down harder. The trees around me loomed like silent sentinels, their dark branches swaying in the wind. I could hear the rush of water somewhere nearby, the sound of a stream, I assumed. The cabin didn't look like much from the outside, but that was the point. I didn't want anything too fancy, something simple where I could unwind and just be. No distractions. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and made my way inside. The door creaked when I opened it, the smell of wood and dust immediately filling my nose. I flicked the light switch, and the dim light of a single bulb lit up the small living room. The furniture was old, the couch faded from years of use, and the fireplace in the corner was cold, but it was homey in its own way. There was something oddly comforting about how untouched the place felt, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. After tossing my things onto the couch, I began to unpack. The kitchen was small, but functional, and I started putting together a simple meal, pasta, just something to fill my stomach. The rain picked up outside, the sound intensifying against the cabin's roof, the steady drumming almost like a lullaby. The first night passed quietly. The rain didn't stop. I sat by the fire for a while, the crackling of the logs mixing with the sound of the storm outside. It was peaceful, so peaceful, in fact, that I almost forgot how strange it felt to be alone. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty, but filled with the sound of my own breathing, the occasional creak of wood as the place settled, and the rhythmic beating of the rain. But then, around midnight, I heard something that wasn't the rain. It was subtle at first, a faint scratching sound. I paused, listening. Came from upstairs. Just a faint scraping, like something lightly brushing against the floor. I sat still, waiting to see if it would come again, but nothing followed. I chalked it up to the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the side of the house. It wasn't uncommon for the trees around here to make strange noises in the wind. It wasn't anything to be worried about. I went to bed soon after that, pulling the thick blankets up to my chin and drifting off to sleep. The house felt warm, despite the coldness of the storm outside, and I quickly lost track of time as I sank deeper into the darkness. When I woke up the next morning, it was still raining, but now it was heavier, the kind of rain that brought with it a thick fog that hung in the air. The windows were streaked with droplets, and the world outside was reduced to a blur of gray. I got up and stretched, heading for the kitchen to make some coffee. The scent of the brewing coffee filled the cabin as I sat down at the small wooden table, sipping slowly. The storm didn't seem like it was going to let up anytime soon. I spent most of the day inside, reading, watching the rain, and just thinking. I didn't have anywhere to be, so I let myself sink into the calm of the cabin. But as the day wore on, I started to notice something. It was subtle at first, but it felt like the air had changed. The sound of the rain, which had been soothing at first, now felt almost oppressive. There was a heaviness to it that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the storm. It was the feeling in the cabin itself, as though the walls were pressing in on me. And then, just after dinner, I heard it again, the faint scratching noise from upstairs. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I froze, the spoon halfway to my mouth. The noise was unmistakable, coming from just above the living room. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. It was something moving. I set my bowl down and stood, my heart thumping in my chest. The storm outside was so loud now that I could barely hear anything else. But the noise upstairs was clear, like a dragging sound, as though something was being pulled slowly across the floor. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I moved toward the stairs. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there, listening. The cabin was quiet now, the noise having stopped as suddenly as it had started. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if something was actually up there. But the scratching hadn't been in my head. It had been real. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen, holding it tightly in my hand. The thought of going upstairs was making my stomach twist, but I couldn't just ignore it. Something was off. It had to be. My mind was racing, and I could feel the tension in my muscles as I slowly made my way up the stairs. The first thing I noticed when I reached the top was that the door to the bedroom at the end of the hall was ajar. It hadn't been open when I came in earlier. I was sure of it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached the door. My breath felt shallow, and my grip tightened on the flashlight. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty. It was exactly as I had left it. Bed unmade, a few scattered things on the floor, but there was something different. The air felt colder here, almost unnaturally so. I moved further into the room, shining the flashlight around. It swept over the walls, the bed, the closet. Everything seemed normal, but then I saw it. A faint trail of what looked like dirt or mud leading across the floor toward the far corner of the room. I followed the trail, my mind racing, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The trail led to the window, where the curtains were drawn tightly shut. But when I reached the window, I noticed something odd. The latch was loose. It had been locked when I arrived. Now it was hanging slightly open. I pushed the curtains aside, peering out into the rain. The world outside was obscured by the heavy fog and downpour, but I saw nothing that could explain the trail inside. The trees were a blur in the storm, nothing moving. I closed the window and locked it again, my mind spinning. There was no logical explanation for what had happened. The door hadn't opened on its own. No one had come into the cabin. The mud or dirt, it didn't make sense. I spent the rest of the evening in a sort of heightened awareness, constantly on edge. The rain continued, relentless. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every shift in the air made me jump. But nothing else happened. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was still overcast, but the heavy rain had stopped. I felt a strange sense of relief, as if the air had cleared with the weather. I packed my things slowly, taking extra time to make sure I wasn't forgetting anything. The cabin felt different now, like it had become a place I no longer wanted to be. I left that morning, locking the door behind me. The drive back down the narrow road was peaceful, but in my mind, I kept replaying the events of the past 2 days. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't make sense. But there was one thing I knew for sure. Whatever it was that happened in that cabin, it wasn't supernatural. It was just strange, too strange to ignore. But I had come out the other side of it, and that was enough for me. I didn't go back to the cabin for a long time after that. But when I finally did, the door was still locked, the dust undisturbed. Everything seemed just as I had left it. Nothing else had ever happened, and that, in itself, was enough to give me peace. The last time I visited Grandma's cabin, I was just a kid. I don't even remember the exact age, maybe 10 or 11, but I know it was a place I thought of as magical at the time, full of mystery and a sort of unexplainable charm. The smell of wood smoke, pine needles, and old leather would always fill the air. There were always stories too, things that Grandma would never quite explain in full but left hints and whispers hanging like the fog that would roll in across the lake. The cabin was tucked away deep in the forest, a good 2 hours outside of town, where cell service didn't work and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was isolated, just the kind of place that had a strange stillness to it. And though I hadn't been back in nearly 2 decades, something about the place pulled me in. Maybe it was nostalgia, or the fact that Grandma had passed away a few months earlier, but whatever the reason, I found myself driving down that same winding road once again. It was late September when I decided to make the trip. The air had a crispness to it, but there was still the occasional warmth of the fading summer lingering in the atmosphere. My old truck rattled as I made my way down the dirt road, the trees thick and dark, the leaves already starting to turn shades of red and gold. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, though I was used to driving this road when I was younger. The road, a small dirt path lined with trees, seemed just as it always had been, narrow, rough, and barely traveled. As I pulled up to the cabin, my heart sank a little. It looked exactly how I remembered, though older and more weathered. The paint was peeling from the wooden walls, the roof sagging in a way that made the whole place feel tired. The porch steps creaked loudly as I climbed them, a sound that sent a shiver through me, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of memories. Inside, the cabin was just as empty and quiet as it always had been. The smell of musty old wood and stale air filled my lungs as I took in the familiar surroundings. The small kitchen, with its old stove that always seemed to be on the verge of breaking down. The living room, with the worn-out couch that Grandma used to sit on for hours, knitting or reading her old books. Everything was in its place, and yet it felt wrong, like it had been abandoned for much longer than just a few months. I set my bag down on the wooden table by the door and took a deep breath. The place was a mess, but it was the kind of mess that came from neglect rather than carelessness. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture, and the windows were streaked with grime, making the sunlight that filtered through seem dim and distant. There was something unsettling about it all. Grandma's cabin was always full of life, even when she was the only one there. But now it felt like the life had been drained from the place. I spent the first few hours just cleaning up, wiping down counters, sweeping the floors. It wasn't much, but it helped settle the unease that had started creeping in. The cabin might have been run down, but it was still standing, and it was still mine now, at least in a way. The sun had started to set by the time I finished tidying up, and I figured I'd go take a walk around the property to clear my mind. The woods surrounding the cabin were dense, the trees packed tightly together, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the earth giving way with each step as I walked deeper into the forest. I had always loved these woods, but tonight, they felt different. The air seemed heavier, like something was watching. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves or the quietness of the place. I walked for what felt like hours, the shadows growing longer and the temperature dropping. The rustling of the leaves underfoot was the only sound that accompanied me, but there was something off about it. It wasn't the normal crunch of fallen leaves. It was softer, almost too soft, like something else was walking alongside me. But every time I stopped and turned around, I saw nothing but trees. Eventually, I came across an old, half-collapsed shed I didn't remember ever seeing before. The roof had caved in, and the walls were barely standing. But something about it felt important, like it had been waiting for me to find it. I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, pushing aside some overgrown branches to get a better look. Inside, the air was thick with decay. The floor was littered with old tools, broken wooden crates, and discarded bits of metal. But it was the old leather bag sitting in the corner that caught my eye. It looked almost brand new, despite the state of everything else around it. I moved cautiously toward it and crouched down to open the bag. Inside were several old, yellowed papers, all tightly folded. I picked one up and unfolded it carefully, my heart racing as I saw the handwriting on it. It was Grandma's handwriting, though different somehow, more erratic, more frantic. The paper was filled with notes and scribbles, none of them making much sense. Words like, "Never go into the woods at night," "They're not what they seem," and "Watch for the eyes" were scattered across the page, half crossed out and rewritten over and over. A chill ran down my spine. What was this? What had Grandma known about the woods that she never told me? My hands shook as I rifled through the rest of the papers, finding more of the same. The notes were filled with warnings, cryptic thoughts, and instructions about things I couldn't understand. I couldn't make sense of it all, but I felt a growing sense of urgency, like I had to get out of there before something happened. I stuffed the papers back into the bag, grabbed it, and hurried out of the shed. The sun was long gone, and the only light left was the dim glow of the moon, filtering through the branches above. As I rushed back toward the cabin, I kept hearing that soft, unnatural rustling in the woods behind me. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but the feeling of being followed, of something just out of sight, clung to me like a shadow. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath heavy in my chest. I locked all the windows and doors, pulling the curtains tight. It felt ridiculous to be so scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there in the woods, and it was waiting. I spent the rest of the night inside, pacing back and forth, trying to make sense of the papers and the strange feeling that was suffocating me. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the cabin walls, made me jump. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, but when I checked, nothing was there. By morning, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically, but the unease didn't leave. It had only grown stronger, a constant presence in the pit of my stomach. I decided it was time to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with whatever was out there lurking in the woods. As I packed my things and headed for the door, I noticed something strange. The front porch steps, which I had heard creaking the night before, were now silent. Too silent. I looked down at them, my heart racing. The boards had been disturbed, scratched as though someone, had been pacing back and forth there in the dark. That was when I heard it again, the rustling in the trees, but this time it wasn't far off. It was close, so close I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me. I turned quickly, looking out into the woods, but there was nothing. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bag, slammed the door behind me, and ran for the truck. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and sped down the dirt road, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Something was watching me. Something still waits in those woods. And the papers, I've kept them hidden away. Maybe it's best that I never fully understand what Grandma was warning me about. Maybe it's better not to know. I don't plan on going back there again. It was the end of August when I finally arrived at the cabin. My name's Lucas, and I was 29 at the time. I had just gone through a pretty tough year. Lots of stress, some personal stuff that was hard to shake off, and my therapist suggested I take some time off to decompress. It sounded like a good idea, so I rented a cabin in the woods up near a small, quiet town called Riverside. The plan was to spend a few weeks in isolation with no distractions. No internet, no phone service. Just me, the trees, and whatever peace I could find in the silence. I'd never been one for cabins in the woods, not for any particular reason, but it had always seemed kind of cliché. Still, it was what was available, and I had no better options. It wasn't a huge cabin, more like a small, modest place tucked away behind a line of old pine trees. The kind of place you see in movies where someone is supposed to have a life-changing experience or find themselves. I didn't think much of it at first. I just needed a place to unwind. The drive there was long, and the roads were winding and narrow, especially as I got farther from the town. I passed a couple of scattered houses, but everything felt isolated. The trees were thick on both sides of the road, stretching up to the sky like towering sentinels, blocking out the sun in some places. The further I went, the fewer signs of human life there seemed to be. The cabin itself was a one-story wooden structure, built right into the side of a small hill. A worn, gravel driveway led up to it, and there was a small front porch with a rocking chair that creaked in the wind. The first thing I noticed when I got out of my car was how quiet it was. Like really quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. It felt almost unnatural, like the trees were holding their breath. The inside of the cabin was what you'd expect. Wooden floors, simple furniture, a small kitchen area with a fridge and a stove, a few shelves with books and knickknacks. There were 2 small bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a living room with a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air had a musty smell to it, but that wasn't surprising for a place this old. I spent the first couple of days settling in. The weather was cool, crisp, and everything around me was green, rich and full of life. I had a few books with me, mostly to keep me busy, but I found myself doing a lot of thinking. The stillness of the place seemed to open up parts of my mind I wasn't used to visiting. It was like my thoughts were louder here. The wind would whistle through the trees, and the distant sound of a creek running somewhere nearby would drift in, but otherwise, there was no sound at all. It was eerie in a way, but I told myself that was part of the charm. On the 3rd day, I decided to take a walk around the area. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, and there was a small trail that led down the hill to a creek. I grabbed a jacket and set off, hoping to get a little exercise and clear my head. The trail was narrow but well-worn, like it had been used regularly by someone before me. I figured it was just another one of those things you find in a place like this, a forgotten pathway. The deeper I walked into the woods, the more I noticed how quiet it was. The normal forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves were barely there. The only thing I could hear was my own footsteps on the dirt path. It felt like the woods were holding something back. I shrugged it off and kept going, but the farther I went, the more unsettled I became. The trees were thick around me, and the light barely made it through the canopy. It was strange, like everything was darker, even though it was still midday. As I followed the trail, I came across something unusual. It was a large tree, but what caught my attention was the way the ground around it was disturbed. The soil had been dug up like someone had been searching for something. There were deep gouges in the earth, and the branches of the tree were broken, as if they had been pulled down with force. I took a step closer to investigate, but as I did, I felt a sharp shiver run down my spine. There was something off about the spot, something I couldn't quite place. My instinct told me to leave it alone, so I stepped back and decided to head back to the cabin. That night, I tried to relax, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the tree. I wasn't someone who normally jumped to conclusions or believed in weird superstitions, but there was something about the way the forest felt, something that didn't sit right. The following days were a blur of trying to shake off the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I kept my walks short, sticking closer to the cabin, but every time I went outside, the silence seemed thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that the woods weren't as empty as they seemed. On the 6th day, I decided to go for another walk, but this time, I was determined to push past the unease. I figured I was just overthinking things. I needed to stop being so paranoid. The weather had shifted slightly, with a light drizzle starting to fall as I left the cabin. The air was thick and smelled like wet earth, which, if anything, seemed to add to the weight of the quiet. I kept walking, telling myself I was being stupid for thinking something was wrong. That was when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they might have been from some animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the size and shape of them didn't match anything I recognized. They were large, almost too big to be from any common animal, and the way they were spaced apart, it was like whoever had walked here was moving at a strange pace. There was something unnatural about it. I knelt down to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. The prints weren't just normal footprints, they were deep, almost as if they had been made by something much heavier than a person or animal. And they were too close together, too precise. It was almost as if whoever made them had been dragging something. The deeper I looked, the more I could see that the earth around the prints had been disturbed, like something had been dragged through the forest recently. I stood up quickly, feeling a wave of panic rise in my chest. My heart was racing, and my breath felt shallow. I wanted to turn around and head back to the cabin, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the feeling that I needed to know what was going on. I followed the trail for a little longer, keeping a careful distance from the footprints. The trail led me deeper into the woods, and soon I was no longer following any marked path. I was simply walking through the trees, my feet crunching on the wet leaves and underbrush. The further I went, the more unsettling the forest felt. The trees seemed taller here, and the undergrowth was thick and tangled. It felt as though the woods were closing in around me. That's when I saw it. It was a clearing, small and almost hidden, surrounded by thick trees. In the center of the clearing, there was a pile of old, broken branches. But what stood out the most was the shape in the middle of it. A dark figure. It was hunched over, and at first I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it was far too large, too wrong to be anything natural. I froze. My mind raced, and my heart was pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, and it didn't make a sound. It was as if it was waiting. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like the fear had paralyzed me. It wasn't until a few minutes passed that the figure shifted. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head toward me. I didn't recognize it at first, but then I saw the eyes. They were too wide, too empty, and they seemed to gleam in the dull light of the overcast sky. It didn't look human, not really. Its face was gaunt. The skin stretched tight over its bones, and its hair, if you could even call it that, was thin and straggly, hanging from its head like something you'd see on a carcass. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. I turned and ran, my heart slamming in my chest. I didn't look back. The sound of the creature, if that's even what it was muffled, but I could hear something moving behind me. It was close, much too close. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, and I didn't stop running until I reached the cabin. I locked every door and window. I didn't sleep that night. I don't even know if I slept the next few days. I was too afraid to leave. The figure in the clearing haunted me. I kept hearing things outside, rustling in the trees, but I never saw anything again. Eventually, I packed up and left. I didn't take any chances, and I didn't tell anyone what happened. There was no need to. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had been exhausted, or maybe the isolation had messed with my head. But as I left the woods behind and made my way back to the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up again. I'll never go back to that cabin. Not in a million years. I've always liked the quiet of the park. The mountains, the trees, the distant hum of the wind. They're familiar, almost like an old friend. It's the reason I became a park ranger in the first place. Not the pay, certainly, but the solitude, the stillness. It was supposed to be easy. Get in, do my job, and keep to myself. But the job hasn't been easy lately, not since that night. My name's Ben Hartley. I'm 34. Been working in this park up in the Idaho Panhandle for almost 5 years now. The job's been mostly routine, and I'm good at it. I know the trails, the wildlife, every stream, and bend of the path. But that night, I found something I wasn't prepared for. Something I can't explain. The park's old. It covers a couple hundred square miles of dense forest, steep hills, and rocky outcroppings. We have a small staff, and most of them are based in a bigger ranger station about 40 miles away. Me? I'm stationed at a smaller cabin on the edge of a secluded part of the park. The cabin's nice enough, built in the early 60s. 2 rooms, a wood stove for heat, and a little kitchenette. It sits right by a trail that leads up to a cliff with a view of the valley below. I've spent a lot of nights out there by myself, but that one, it felt different. It was mid-October, and the air had a bite to it, that sharpness that makes you think winter's right around the corner. The trees were turning, the leaves in shades of amber and gold, and the scent of pine filled the air whenever the wind kicked up. It had been a quiet week. Too quiet. We hadn't seen many hikers, and the animals were acting strangely. Not that they ever make sense. One minute the deer are grazing, the next, they're bolting through the underbrush like they're being chased. I was sitting on the porch that evening, a cup of coffee in my hands, staring at the fading sun when I noticed something strange down the trail. It was just a flicker at first, like something moving through the trees too quickly, too low to the ground. I thought it was a deer, maybe, but the shape didn't look right. It wasn't the right size or the way it moved. I squinted, trying to focus, but it was gone as fast as it appeared. I shook it off, probably a trick of the light. I spent the rest of the evening inside, reading over some reports from other rangers. I was getting ready for bed when I heard something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A thudding sound, like something heavy being dropped on the ground, came from the direction of the trail. I grabbed my flashlight and a jacket, heading outside to check it out. The cold hit me immediately, but it wasn't the chill that got my attention. It was the stillness. The air had that unnatural quiet to it, like everything was holding its breath. Even the wind had stopped. I walked down the trail, keeping my steps light. The light from the cabin's porch faded behind me, leaving only the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The trail was narrow, winding through trees that seemed to stretch forever into the night. As I walked, I noticed more strange things. Broken branches that didn't look like they'd been snapped by an animal. Long scrapes on the bark of trees, like something had been dragging itself along the trunks. Then I saw it. Just off the trail, partially hidden behind a large rock, was a pile of something. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. It looked like some kind of debris. But as I got closer, I realized it was something worse. A large, twisted bundle of fur and flesh. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. The fur was matted dark. There was a sickly, almost rotten smell to it. I took a step closer, my heart thudding in my chest. The shape of it didn't make sense. It wasn't an animal, not fully. I could see patches of skin, too, stretched taut over jagged bones. Something about the shape of the legs didn't look right. They were twisted, almost bent backward. The head was the worst part. It was human, or at least part human. The face was twisted into something unnatural, a grotesque blend of animal and something else. Something worse. I don't know how long I stood there, staring. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But I couldn't. My flashlight shook in my hand, and I backed away, almost tripping over my own feet. I turned and ran back to the cabin, not looking back. The image of that thing burned into my mind. When I reached the safety of the cabin, I locked the door and sat by the stove, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what I had seen. A sick animal? A prank? But it didn't feel like either of those. The rest of the night was uneventful, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things outside. Small noises, like something was moving around in the dark. It wasn't until the early morning that I finally fell into a restless sleep. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had been a dream, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I wasn't sure if I was just spooked or if there was something out there in the woods, something I didn't understand. I spent the day trying to distract myself, going over maps, doing routine checks, trying to keep my mind busy. But by the time evening rolled around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to go back down the trail, despite the knot in my stomach. Maybe I'd find something that would explain what I had seen, or at least put my mind at ease. I wasn't expecting what I found. The body, if you could even call it that, was gone. The place where I had seen it the night before was empty, but the ground was disturbed. There were deep, jagged marks in the earth, like something heavy had been dragged through. I crouched down to get a better look, my heart racing again. The marks led off into the forest, deeper than I had ever gone, toward the cliffside. I didn't follow them. I wasn't about to go any further. That night, I packed up my things and called in to headquarters. I told them I had seen something strange, but I didn't want to admit to what I had really found. They didn't question me too much. The morning I left, I didn't tell anyone about the marks or the strange shape I had found, or the dragging marks in the earth. I drove out of the park and didn't look back. And maybe that was cowardly, but I didn't care. I had seen enough.